we're starting to understand, the dynamic is working in a completely different culture, different religion that we hadn't experienced for a long time. So it was so there were some parallels. We were, the training was, there was sort of understanding that yes, you are in Afghanistan. Remember, people are, different region, different cultures, so respecting, mosque, and it's part of, what we train. Law of armed conflict. I think the British were very good at, upholding that sort of thing. The training is not just about training; it's also the fact that we do that well when we deploy. So, yeah.
I want to talk about trust, because you obviously had to work alongside the Afghans, certainly when you were doing more outreach work, I'll use that word, and looking more at how you could help bits of society and some of the elements of their society that you felt you could enhance in some ways. So you work very closely with Afghans, actually. How did that work in your head?
Well, I think the interesting is you don't really. It's a human rapport. You don't really look at them and say, oh, you're an Afghan. We don't speak the same language. You look different. You smell different. And everything. You don't really. You do that. Again, you do that human rapport. You understand. You try to understand what they want. And you try to communicate with them. What you think is right or wrong. Your point of view. And you obviously the difficulty. You have a third person, your interpreter, that does that. You're not necessarily sure that the interpreter is actually translating exactly, what you're trying to say. But you don't really see them differently. Especially when they were, Afghan National Forces and Afghan National Army. There was kind of a pride for them. You could see wearing the uniform, the ANA, and the Afghan flag. I still have an Afghan flag. Them having the Afghan flag, and you can relate to that because you feel the same. It's a soldiers bond. They are soldiers with soldiers, and you appreciate that in a way. So, and you understand that they are fighting, and you believe they are fighting, for their country, for their people. So therefore, you feel good about, if you can help them, to be with them. But there's also a time when you question, how they interact with each other. How the officers were, where their soldiers, how they were, slapping, beating up. It was, and it's a cultural thing. You have to sometimes step back and say, this is not the British Army. This is not the Western way. This is the Afghan way. And this is where potentially links to what we discussed at the start, that potentially the signs were there that, and it's not for me to, to very assess that, but it's the fact that, what makes an army cohesive, what makes it, is that the hard discipline, the sort of that officers says and soldiers do, or is that more the, the cohesion as people that have the same value, the same understanding, they share the same bonds. If you don't have that, like potentially we didn't have it with the Afghan National Army, was the fact that you have Pashtuns, trying to work alongside Tajiks, and they are different in all sorts, and therefore try to, put that together was probably maybe a bit too much, maybe I think. But no, I think I've, I do remember one particular story when we're building PBs, patrol bases for the Afghans National Army. So, and we use local contractors because we want them to be built the Afghan way. So mud, hay, you've seen there's compounds as we call them, and and part of the project that was leading, we were building those compounds for the Afghan National Army. And then one day, one of my local contractors come to me, and he was in bits. He's been beaten up, bleeding and all that. And I asked the interpreter, and he said, "No, I can't tell you." And he told me eventually, what happened is a local commander, Afghan commander, went to see him and say, "You need to pay me to do the work. So you need to ask the British more money, so you can give me a bribe. And if you don't give me the bribe, you can't do the work." And obviously the contractor, I had his trust talking about that. Yet he trusted me because he was getting work done. You know, so he was happy, he could feed his family and, you know, extended and his tribe because we were giving him work, and I used to come and see him, so he saw me on the ground, so he was happy and he trusted me, so he said no to the commander. So the commander had him beaten up. So I had to have a conversation with the commander, and I remember always he introduced himself. He was the Lion of Babaji. That was his name. I'm the Lion of Babaji, and we sat down in his tent with his soldiers around, and for about an hour and a half he told me how he was proud that he fought, you know, the Soviet first as a Mujahideen, you know, then he fought the Taliban first, and then now he was fighting alongside, you know, the Brits, you know, the Americans, NATO, you know, everybody basically, you know, and I was trying to tell him that yes, it's all great, you know, and I respect that, and you know, I value the fact that you are a great warrior, but I said, but you need to stop, you know, you cannot do that, because if you do that, that will never work, you know, and you start to understand that culture is different, you know, bribes, you know, what we would call corruption, it's a way of life, it's kind of normal for them that you have to give a little extra to whoever, you know, the police stop you on the highway 1, you have to give a little something, because that's just the way it is. And then we talked about a couple of hours, and I was very firm in telling him again and again that, you know, do not touch because otherwise I will stop. And if I stop building your PBs, you know, your commander will ask the question why, you know, the British and the international community has stopped building PBs. So he understood that, and he stopped, and it was fine after. But it was that kind of thing that you realize that yes, you know, the level of trust is there, but you have to be always mindful, especially as I mentioned before, you know, with the insider threat that you would, you know, and something that we haven't discussed yet is the fact that they are very proud people. So you can't really, you know, they can't be humiliated, especially in front of others, because that becomes kind of another code, you know, code of revenge that we have in Afghanistan. You know, like you kill my cousin, well, I will kill one of your cousins. But it also applies to how you treat, you know, people with seniority. So he was a commander, Afghan commander. I have to show him respect. I could not tell him that he was, you know, corrupt and, you know, and it was wrong. I had to be careful because the soldiers were there, and I knew that potentially, you know, there will be some retaliation, that, you know, that a soldier would feel the need to avenge, you know, the honor of his commander. So that's another thing. The trust was, you had to understand that, and it's the time spent in Afghanistan that allow you to, you know, to appreciate how far you can go in terms of trust, and how little at times you have to give. So there was never a, you know, trust in terms of, yeah, I trust you because you wear a uniform. You always have to take the time to understand the context, and, you know, always have that kind of, you know, moment to say, you know, okay, we spend a lot of time together. You know things about me. I know things about you. You know a little bit about my family because it's important. I know a little bit about your family, but let's not become too close, because you don't know different lives. You know, his life away when he doesn't see me is not, you know, something that I knew. So, so that's the kind of thing. So the trust was there, but he was a, you know, was a kind of a, you know, certain degrees of trust. You know, it was never open, and does that make sense? So, yeah.
You talk about the insider threat,
Mm-hmm.
and you're saying you never quite trusted them, really, that's what you're saying. And you witnessed a number of incidents. Are you able to disclose what happened?
I can't really, but I think it was very much, you know, sort of thing. I'll give you a broad one. Was, you know, sort of Afghan soldiers coming to one of our compound where we were sharing with them, and they were, you know, the drill was they had to unload their weapons before coming into the camp, and these particular individuals didn't want to do that for whatever reason. Again, you know, something that, you know, sometimes the logic was not necessarily there. You know, it's something that they've done previously, but for whatever reason that day they didn't want to do it. So the British soldiers at the gate say, you know, you can't come in. So they started to argue, and basically what happened is, you know, these British soldiers were firm and said no, and you know, they were trained to say, you know, you're not and push